Children. The wagon hit a rut, and Wren's teeth clacked together hard enough to taste copper. Children. She didn't say anything. She had learned, in the 4 hours since they left Caldwell, that saying anything to the man beside her was largely pointless. Tate Greer drove with the reins loose in his big, scarred hands and his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, and he did not appear to require conversation. He did not appear to require much of anything, actually. Children. He had shown up at her father's funeral with a proposition and a handshake and the patience of something carved from old wood, and he had waited in silence while she made the worst decision of her life. Children. She was 22 years old. She had $11, a carpetbag with a broken clasp, and a husband she had known for 6 days. Children. The land outside Caldwell flattened fast, then folded itself upward into the dark hills of the Texas Panhandle, as if the earth had changed its mind about being hospitable. Mesquite gave way to cedar, cedar gave way to juniper, and the sky, which had been a flat, hot blue when they left, was now pulling gray at the edges. Wren gripped the wooden seat with both hands and watched the trail narrow. Children. Tate had come to her father's creditors first. That was how she heard of him, not from the man himself, but from old Dunning at the land office, who told her that a Tate Greer had already paid the back taxes on the Aldridge parcel, which was to say, her parcel, the 12 acres her father had spent 30 years scratching at and died, owing 3 years of taxes on. Dunning had handed her the receipt like a verdict. Children. She had gone looking for Tate Greer with fire in her chest, and found a man who smelled of cedar dust, and looked at her the way you'd look at a fence post you were deciding whether to replace. He wasn't young. He wasn't handsome in any way she had a word for. He was broad-shouldered and quiet-eyed, and he had the kind of hands that told you a person had never once in their life done anything delicate. Children. He told her he had a place up in the Caprock. He told her he needed a wife who wasn't afraid of work. He told her he would clear her father's debts in full, all of them, including the note held by First Federal that she had not yet worked up the courage to open. Children. She had asked him what kind of place. Children. A working place, he said, and that was all. Children. She should have pressed harder. She understood that now, watching the trail ahead dissolve into rutted dirt that wound between limestone outcroppings and stands of shin oak. A working place. It was a sentence designed to mean nothing. Children. The wind picked up from the northwest, dry and smelling of approaching rain, and Wren pulled her wool coat tighter. She had worn it because it was the best one she owned, the navy coat her mother had left her. It was not warm enough for whatever this was becoming. Children. Where exactly are we going? She asked. Children. Tate looked at the sky still a ways. Children. That's not an answer. Children. No, he agreed and said nothing else. Children. She stared at him until her eyes ached, willing him to say something that would reassure her, or at minimum, something that would give her information. His jaw worked slowly. He had a habit of moving his jaw when he was thinking, a slight grinding motion she had noticed the day he came to make his offer. It was the only tell he had. Children. The afternoon went gray and then grayer. The trail began climbing in earnest, switchbacking up rocky shelves of caprock escarpment. Children. And the horses, 2 heavy-boned bays that moved like they'd made this trip 100 times, leaned into the grade without complaint. Wren's thighs ached from bracing against the incline. She was hungry. Children. She had been too nervous to eat before they left, and the single biscuit she'd had at dawn was a distant memory. Children. Is there anything to eat? Children. Tate reached behind the seat without looking and produced a cloth bundle. Inside was hardtack, dried venison, and a small waxed wheel of hard cheese. He held it out and she took it. She tried the hardtack first. It was the consistency of a shingle. Children. Thank you, she managed. Children, he grunted. Children. She ate the cheese instead and stared at the hills and thought about what exactly constituted the absolute bottom of a person's options. She had decided, somewhere between the cheese and the venison, that she had found it. Children. The rain came just before dark, not hard but steady and mean, the kind that worked through cloth and settled into bone. Tate pulled the horses off the trail under the overhang of a limestone shelf and unhitched them with the economical movements of a man who had done this so many times it required no thought. He strung a canvas lean-to from the wagon to the rock face. He did not offer to help her down. Children. Wren climbed down herself, misjudged the step in the poor light, and came down hard on her ankle in the wet gravel. Pain shot up to her knee. She grabbed the wagon wheel, breathing through her nose, refusing to make a sound. Children. Tate walked past her with a hobble rope, and she heard him stop. Children. You hurt? Children. No. Children. A pause. You're standing on one foot. Children. I'm resting. Children. He didn't say anything else. She heard him move on to the horses. She stood there on one foot in the rain and focused very hard on not crying, because she had made a decision and she was going to live in it. And crying on the first night was not something she was willing to do. Children. They ate cold from the cloth bundle, sitting on opposite sides of a miserable little fire that Tate had coaxed out of damp cedar with some kind of technical patience she didn't have a name for. The smoke went sideways. It stung her eyes. She ate the rest of the venison and stared at the coals and listened to the rain tap against the canvas. Children. How much further? She finally asked. Children. Half a day if the draw isn't flooded. Children. And if it is? Children, he chewed. We wait. Children. She looked at him across the fire. His face was unremarkable in the orange light. Not cruel, not kind, just present, like the limestone behind him, like the weather. Children. What did you tell your neighbors, she asked, about bringing a wife back? Children. His jaw worked nothing. Children. They don't know. Children. There aren't any neighbors. Children. She absorbed that. The isolation of it settled over her like the smoke, slow and pervasive. No neighbors, a working place, a man who communicated in single syllables. She had married the silence itself. Children. She went to sleep on the wagon bed under a canvas tarp and woke up twice from cold, and once from what she was fairly certain was a coyote investigating the food bundle. Children. Which Tate had apparently already hung from a cedar branch, because when she sat up in the dark, the bundle was gone, and Tate was sitting against the limestone with his rifle across his knees, awake. Children. Watching the dark with the patient attention of a man who did not appear to need sleep the way other people did. Children. She lay back down. She listened to the rain slow and stop. She thought about the $11 in her coat pocket and calculated, not for the first time, whether it was enough to get her back to somewhere, and what somewhere would look like without her father's debts cleared, and whether $11 divided by the cost of a train ticket, plus food plus lodging, added up to anything survivable. Children. It didn't. Children. She already knew it didn't. Children. She closed her eyes and went back to sleep. Children. The draw was passable by morning, barely, the water brown and fast but shallow enough for the horses to cross with the wagon lifted on its springs and Wren sitting rigid and gripping the seat while the current shoved at the wheels. Tate drove through it like it was a minor inconvenience, which perhaps, to him it was. Children. On the other side, the trail climbed again through a cedar brake, and then opened suddenly onto a high plain of grama grass that rolled to the north in long undulations, the sky above it huge and scrubbed pale by last night's rain. It was, Wren admitted to herself privately, beautiful, the kind of beautiful that didn't care if you noticed it. Children. This yours? She asked. Children. Some of it. Children. She waited, but the elaboration did not come. Children. They drove another 2 hours north across the grassland, the trail gradually becoming a pair of ruts pressed into the sod, and then just the suggestion of ruts, and then nothing she could identify as a trail at all. The horses knew where they were going. She could feel it in the way they moved, a purposefulness in their gait that hadn't been there on the switchbacks. Children. She smelled the cedar smoke before she saw anything. Then the land dipped, and they descended into a shallow canyon cut by a dry creek, and there at the far end, where the canyon walls curved and sheltered, and the afternoon sun would reach longest, was what she had been promised. Children, a working place. Children. What Wren saw first was not a house. She saw a gate. It was set between two heavy cedar posts, and the gate itself was wrought iron, and it was not the gate of a working place. Children. It was the gate of something else entirely. The iron had been worked into the shape of climbing vines and running horses, and it was 16 feet across if it was an inch, and beyond it, children. Visible through the ironwork was a courtyard of flat limestone pavers, swept clean, and beyond the courtyard, children, a house. Children. Not a homesteader's house. Not the soddy or the pine plank shack she had been manufacturing in her mind for 6 days as a way of bracing herself for reality. Children. A house of cut limestone blocks, 2 full stories, with a wide covered porch that ran the entire front face, and green shutters on windows that were large enough to actually admit light, real glass-paned windows, many of them, and a stone chimney at each end, bleeding smoke into the thin canyon air, which meant fires had been laid, which meant someone knew they were coming. Children. Wren forgot to breathe for a moment. Children. Tate pulled the horses to a stop in front of the gate. He climbed down without ceremony, pulled a key from his coat, and worked the lock. The gate swung inward. He looked at her sitting on the wagon seat, staring. Children. What is this? She said. Her voice came out wrong, scraped thin. Children. Tate looked at the house the way you look at something you've seen so many times it stopped registering. Home, he said. Children. Whose home? Children. Ours. Children. The word landed strangely. She turned it over in her mind, the way you turn a stone to see what's under it. Ours. She looked at the man in the patched coat with the grease-stained hands, and the jaw that worked when he was thinking, and she looked at the limestone house with the real glass windows, and the iron gate with the horses worked into it, and the geometries refused to match. Children. She climbed down from the wagon. Her ankle, still tender from last night, complained. She ignored it. Children. She walked to him. Children. She stood close enough to see the weathering around his eyes, the deep-cut lines of a man who spent his days squinting into wind. She held his gaze. Children. You have this, she said. Not a question, a statement with an edge on it. Children. Yes. Children. And you came to Caldwell dressed like a hired hand. Children. I dress for the work. Children. You let me think. She stopped. The full inventory of what she had thought crowded into her chest at once. She had thought she was marrying hardship. She had thought she was buying herself the barest survival. She had sat in that wagon for 2 days eating hardtack and sleeping under a tarp and calculating whether $11 could get her back to nothing, and all the while, children. She slapped him. Children. It was not premeditated. Her hand moved before her brain had finished forming the thought, and the crack of it in the quiet canyon air was very loud. Tate's head moved slightly to the left. He absorbed it the way the limestone walls absorbed the echo, completely without drama. Children. He turned back to face her. His cheek had gone red. Children. I deserved that, he said. Children. You deserve more than that, she said. Her voice was shaking. Her hand was shaking. You let me count my money in the dark, wondering if I could afford to leave. Children. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly. Something older and harder than guilt. Children. Come inside, he said. I'll explain it. Children. Explain it now. Children. His jaw worked. He looked at her with those flat, unremarkable eyes for a long moment. Children. 8 years ago I came up here with nothing but a mule and a mineral claim. I found what I found, built what I built. Word got out eventually. A woman from Amarillo heard of it. He paused. Children. I brought her up in a hired buggy, fed her well, showed her all of it on the first day. His voice didn't change pitch or speed. It stayed flat, like reading from something. She lasted 5 months. Children. When I came in from the south pasture in March, she was gone. Children. Took my surveying instruments, the silver service, and the notes on the mineral claim. Took the good horse. Left me a letter that said the inconvenience of my company warranted compensation. He looked at the gate. She wasn't wrong about the inconvenience. She was wrong to take what wasn't hers. Children. Wren stood in the cool canyon air and listened to this, and felt the fury in her chest complicate itself. Children. So you tested me, she said. Children. I needed to know who I was bringing onto my land. Children. By making me believe I was marrying poverty. Children. By letting you choose under real conditions. Children. She stared at him. Those aren't the same thing. Children. No, he said, they're not. Children. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to soften it. He stood there in his patched coat and looked at her, and waited, and the waiting had the same quality as everything else about him, patient, immovable, entirely unwilling to pretend. Children. She wanted to slap him again. She also, in some small and aggravating corner of her chest, understood him, which made her angrier. Children. If I had quit, she said. If I had sat down in that draw and refused to cross, what then? Children. He considered this with his full attention, the jaw working. I'd have taken you back to Caldwell. Children. And cleared your father's debts anyway. I said I would. Children. She blinked. Children. You'd have done it regardless. Children. I gave you my word. Children. She looked at the gate. She looked at the house. She looked at the man who had pulled her out of a flooded draw and driven through a night of rain without sleeping, and paid her dead father's debts on principle, and apparently expected nothing she was not willing to give. Children. She walked through the gate without another word. Children. The inside of the house smelled of pine resin and lantern oil, and something baking. The ceilings were high, the floors were wide plank, pine worn smooth. A fireplace ran the full width of the front room. Children. Built from the same limestone as the exterior walls, and it was laid and burning, and the heat of it came out to meet her like something alive. Bookshelves framed the windows. Children. A wool rug in dark red and blue stretched across the floor, dusty at the edges but clearly fine. Children. An oil lamp on the center table threw warm light up to the rafters. Children. She stood in the middle of it and said nothing for a long moment. Children. Kitchen's through there, Tate said behind her. Bedroom upstairs, second door. There are clothes in the wardrobe, belonged to my mother. She was about your size. He paused. There's water heated off the stove if you want to wash. Children. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway, backlit, his hat in his hands, and for the first time she noticed that he looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of a long drive. The deeper tired of a man who had been carrying something heavy for longer than was strictly sustainable. Children. Who laid the fire, she asked. Children. I rode ahead last night while you were sleeping. There's a line shack at the mouth of the canyon. I left the wagon and horses with you. Children. He had left her sleeping in the wagon in the dark to ride ahead and lay fires so the house would be warm when she arrived. Children. She turned away before whatever was happening in her face could finish happening. Children. I'll want to see the kitchen, she said. Children. The first 2 weeks were a careful armed negotiation conducted entirely in domestic terms. Children. Wren found the kitchen and made it hers within 4 days, not because she was performing wifely duty, but because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still gave her too much room to think about all the ways her life had rearranged itself without consulting her. She organized the root cellar. She found the flour, discovered it was stored badly, and told Tate he had 3 months before it went to weevil. Children. He looked at her with that unremarkable expression and said, "What would you need to fix it?" Children, she told him. Children. He rode to the nearest town, which was farther than she would have guessed, and came back 2 days later with everything on the list. Children. She baked bread. The smell of it moved through the house like a change in weather. Tate stood in the kitchen doorway the first evening and looked at the loaves cooling on the rack and said, "That's the first time this kitchen smelled like that." And she didn't ask him what he meant, because the answer was already evident, and some things didn't require making explicit. Children. They did not talk easily. Conversation between them was a functional instrument. Here is what needs doing. Here is what was done. Here is what I found in the south pasture that you should know about. Children. He was running cattle on the upper plain, she discovered, and the mineral operation was largely finished, the vein thinned to barely worth working. Children. And what he had built here in the canyon was what he intended to remain. Children. He told her this at supper one evening, with the directness of a man reporting weather. Children. You're not going back, she said. Children. No. Children. She thought about Caldwell, the boarding house, the bank, the narrow tunnel of options she had been standing in when Tate Greer walked into it. Neither am I, she said, and meant it more than she expected. Children. He looked at her over his coffee cup. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Children. On the 14th night, the wind came down from the north and hit the canyon with a sound like a fist striking a door. Wren lay in the upstairs bedroom, listening to the shutters rattle and could not sleep. She took the oil lamp and went down to the kitchen for water, and found Tate sitting at the table in the dark with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. Children. She put her lamp on the table. She sat down across from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Children. You couldn't sleep either, she said. Children. I don't sleep much. Children. She looked at his hands wrapped around the cup, the scar tissue on the knuckles, the ingrained darkness in the creases that didn't come out no matter how he washed. Working hands. She had grown up with her father's hands, which looked like that. It was, she realized, a shape she trusted. Children. Can I ask you something, she said. Children. He looked at her. Children. If I had taken everything and left, the way she did. She didn't use the woman's name. She didn't know it and didn't want it. Would you have done this again? Found someone else the same way? Children. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Children. No, he said. Children. Then why did you try it once more? Children. He looked at the lamp flame. Because the alternative was staying up here alone until I couldn't remember what another person sounded like. Children. It was the most she had heard him say at once about anything that wasn't logistics. She sat with it for a moment. Children. You could have been honest with me, she said, not accusing anymore, just true. Children. I could have, he agreed, but you'd have come for the house, not for the life. Children. She wanted to argue with that. She found she couldn't, not entirely, not with herself sitting across from the knowledge of what she'd been calculating in the dark of the wagon. She'd have come for the house. Anyone would. Children. And now, she said. Children. He looked at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were not flat in the way she'd been reading them. They were careful. There was a difference. Children. That's up to you, he said. He reached into the pocket of his work shirt and set something on the table between them. A key. Iron, the length of her hand, the head of it worked into a small running horse that matched the gate. Children. Front gate, he said. The spring grass'll be up in 6 weeks. Trail out'll be passable. Children. She looked at the key. Children. She had $11 in her coat pocket upstairs. She had a bad ankle and a carpetbag, with a broken clasp and a father who was dead and debts that were cleared, and nothing in Caldwell that constituted a reason to return. Children. She looked at Tate Greer, who had ridden through the night in the rain to lay fire so she'd be warm, who had put everything on the table now in a single iron key, who was waiting with that same maddening, immovable patience for whatever she was going to do. Children. She picked up the key. Children. She turned it over in her fingers. The small horse was worn smooth on one side. She wondered how many times he had turned it over in his own. Children. The flower situation in the cellar is going to take the better part of a month to sort properly, she said. Children. He was still, the way the canyon was still after the wind passed. Children. And the cattle records you showed me last week are a catastrophe, she continued. You've been running 2 sets of numbers that don't reconcile. Someone needs to fix that. Children. She set the key back down on the table, but she set it on her side. Children. Tate looked at it. Something moved through his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the nearest adjacent thing, a loosening around the eyes, a fractional release in the set of his jaw. Children. I've been meaning to sort the records, he said. Children. You've been putting it off. Children. Yes. Children. I can see that. Children. The lamp burned between them in the warm kitchen, and outside the wind pressed against the canyon walls with all the force it had and found nothing to dislodge. Children. Wren wrapped her hands around her water glass and felt the deep, settled warmth of the kitchen settle into her. Children. And for the first time since she had stood in the land office, reading a receipt with her name on it, and understood that she had nothing. Children. She felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of having somewhere to be. Children. I'll need my own horse, she said. Children. There's a mare in the south barn, Tate said. Gray, spirited. She's been waiting for someone she'll work with. Children. You think she'll work with me? Children. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the canyon gate. Careful, present. Like she was a thing he was learning the shape of and finding so far that the shape held. Children. Yes, he said, I think she will. Children. I keep thinking about the moment Wren picked up that iron key and set it back down on her side of the table. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't, really. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when a person has thought something all the way through and arrived somewhere solid. Children. What got her there wasn't luck, it wasn't love, not yet. It was something harder to name and more durable than either of those things. Children. She could have quit at the flooded draw. She could have sat down in the wet gravel after she twisted her ankle and decided she had already paid more than the deal was worth. Nobody would have blamed her. The conditions were brutal, and the man beside her was giving her almost nothing to work with. But she didn't quit, children. She got back up, and she kept going, and I think that matters more than people give it credit for. That particular decision, made in the dark with no audience and no guarantee of anything on the other side, children. That's the thing about real endurance. It doesn't happen in front of anybody. It happens in the moments when staying is harder than leaving, and you stay anyway, children. Not because you're certain it's right, but because you're not willing to find out what happens if you don't. Children. And then there's Tate. I have more complicated feelings about Tate, and I think that's appropriate. What he did was not kind. Letting someone believe they've married hardship, when you have the means to spare them is a form of deception, and Wren was right to slap him and right to say so, clearly, without softening it. The part that makes me think, though, is why he did it, children. Not the excuse. He gave her the excuse. The story about the woman who took the silver and the surveying instruments and left a note calling it compensation. I mean the reason underneath the excuse. He had been hurt badly enough that he couldn't figure out how to trust again without building the test directly into the conditions. That's not wisdom. But it is human, children. And understanding why a person does a wrong thing is different from excusing it. And I think Wren understood that difference, which is its own kind of intelligence. The kind that lets you hold two true things at once without needing one of them to disappear. Children. What I come back to every time I think about this story is that both of them had to be a certain kind of person for it to work out the way it did. Wren had to have the backbone to endure what she endured, and the clarity to be angry about it honestly instead of swallowing it. Tate had to have the integrity to clear her father's debts regardless of her choice, and the honesty to hand her the key without conditions. Children. Take either of those qualities out of the equation, and the whole thing falls apart. She leaves in May and he deserves it, or she stays and resents him and he deserves that too. Children. The outcomes we get are usually downstream of who we actually are when nobody's watching and nothing's guaranteed. Wren was the same person in the dark of that wagon, counting her $11, children, as she was sitting across from Tate in the warm kitchen. That consistency is what I find myself most moved by. Not the happy ending. I'm not sure it's fully a happy ending yet, children. Just the beginning of something honest. But the fact that she arrived at it by being exactly herself the whole way through. Children. That's the only thing I know how to trust, really. Not circumstances, not promises. Just the evidence of who a person is when the conditions are hard and the audience is nobody.